me ask you something, John.
Sure.
Are we friends?
Yes.
I'd like to think we're friends.
Absolutely.
That's great. I got a friend out here.
Man, Lawrence Fishburne is so menacing. When he says things like, I hope we're friends, you're just like, oh my God, he's going to kill me right now. He kills his friends. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in this solo episode, we are going to find ourselves in space. I will say that, I like to spend a little bit more time with the sci-fi genre when I do these solo episodes, so this one's not going to be very much different. We are going to explore Slingshot. This movie came out just last year as of the date of this recording, 2024. And it really kind of just flew under the radar because I think it was just a streaming release. You can find it right now on Paramount Plus. It might stay on Paramount Plus. It might be a Paramount film. I'm not entirely sure, but in any case, it flew under the radar. It doesn't have a great IMDb rating, 5.7. It's not that big. It's, kind of on the downswing as far as popularity goes. So, it did get released on August 30th. So it's been out for a little while, but I recently watched it a few weeks ago, and I'm like, this is going to be a great episode for the podcast because of the themes, the psych concepts, which we're going to get into. The film was directed by Mikael Hafström and written by R. Scott Adams and Nathan Parker. It stars, our main character is Casey Affleck as John. That's all he's referred to as in the movie. Lawrence Fishburne plays Captain Franks. Again, the only reference we get to his name. And Tomer Capone plays Nash. Now, you might be familiar with Tomer because he is Frenchie in The Boys. He's starting to expand his roles, which I love because he's a great actor. Again, Nash is the only name that we get for him. We get no backstory on anyone but John in the form of flashbacks where he has interactions with Emily Beecham, who plays Zoe. A few other people exist on planet Earth. David Morrissey plays a character named Sam Napier, and I would say that's probably the biggest name. And there are several other smaller bit characters throughout the film. The vast majority of the film takes place on a spacecraft with the characters that I named first. So John, Captain Franks, and Nash. And they're on a spacecraft headed toward Saturn's moon, Titan, for a mission. And they have to use, I think, Jupiter or another celestial body to slingshot them, to get them enough oomph, enough acceleration to get to Titan in a good amount of time. Periodically on this mission, they use stasis chambers, which apparently are one per room. Interesting tidbit there. And so the goal is to get to Titan to establish some base and all of that. And so all of the ensuing drama comes from the setting itself, the situation. Spoiler alerts ahead. Spoiler alert, of course, because I'm going to get into the twist of it. So if you want to watch this movie, I think it was pretty well acted by the actors, especially Casey Affleck and Lawrence Fishburne. The ending is a little obnoxious, leaves some potential for debate. Does it rise to the level of Christopher Nolan and the ending of Inception with the top that either keeps spinning or maybe looks like it's going to fall over, right? So there's some ambiguity associated with that. Some ambiguity exists at the end of this film, but I think the end is a bit obnoxious, but I think it does fit with the overall narrative. Great use of camera angles and close-ups to really hammer home the anxiety that is present in, spaceflight, right? As far as several decades of data would suggest that being in space is not the same thing, demonstrably not the same thing as being on Earth, right? So let's go ahead and explore some of these psych concepts in this movie. So like I said, let's first discuss the aspect of being in space. There are a ton of books written, not a lot of research articles written because of small sample sizes, but a ton of firsthand and secondhand accounts of spaceflight ever since, Yuri Gagarin went up in his pod and did like the suborbital flight, and then, astronauts and cosmonauts since then, right? As well as other countries contributing their people to being out in space. And then, of course, billionaires recently. Space is not the same thing as being on Earth, right? Or I should say, space is space. But I will, I'll add to this, I'll rephrase my conceit here by saying that microgravity situations are going to be different than regular gravity situations. In the movie, though, in Slingshot, the spacecraft that is heading toward Titan has some form of artificial gravity. We don't really know how it's being generated, how it's being created. We don't know. It seems like it's, approximately Earth gravity, between 0.9 and 1 G, I would say, because there's not a lot of like moving through the spacecraft microgravity. I mean, from a filmmaking perspective, it's going to be a lot easier to just have a set that looks like a spacecraft and then just walk on it normally, right? Instead of doing all of the special effects, whether that is practical or CGI effects of microgravity, right? So they made the decision that somehow the spacecraft has artificial gravity. It's not a giant ring that's spinning in perpetuity like in 2001: A Space Odyssey or Elysium or whatever sci-fi property you want to see, where they actually put the time and effort into explaining how the artificial gravity works, or the real gravity, I guess. So there's artificial gravity, so we can put that to bed. So we're not actually talking about the effects of microgravity or zero gravity on the characters in this film. So that's important. But instead, the comparisons to real life astronaut experience is about the isolation Okay. So, like I said, we have 3 characters on this spacecraft. But as we learn throughout the film, that there may only be one person on this spacecraft. And in an effort to deal with the isolation of being alone on this spacecraft, the character created 2 additional identities. I said the characters were John, Captain Franks, and Nash. Well, we learn at the end of the film that's all one person's name. Captain John Nash Franks.
Am I alone?
Yes.
And in the flashbacks, we only are exposed to Casey Affleck's John as he is preparing to, well, as he is interviewing and training to be the lone astronaut for this mission. And there are clues that are given in these flashbacks. There are very extensive clues. When these flashbacks occur, by the way, is when he goes into prolonged stasis or hibernation, where he goes into this sleep because it's taking several months because they have to use the gravity assisted slingshot maneuver to get to Titan. 6 months is how long it takes for a speedy mission to Mars, right? Quickest we could get there with our current technology is about 6 months. Like, we're going so much more in distance that it takes a lot longer. So they have these stasis pods as well. We don't know when in the future all of this is occurring. It seems to be, a near future where things don't look that different, but technology exists for artificial gravity and stasis.
Gentlemen, let's try and keep our heads on our shoulders.
So John is shown in these flashbacks when he goes into hibernation because he's reliving these moments with this character Zoe, who he ends up falling in love with and then regrets having a relationship with her when they're not supposed to because she's working with the mission from Earth, and he gets attached. And part of the reason I think he ends up with this, psychotic episode due to the isolation is because he misses Zoe, and that's what he focuses on when he goes into stasis. So we have this issue here where psychosis comes from the isolation. But before we learn that John is the only person aboard this spacecraft, we actually explore isolation from 3 different angles. John, who seemingly is caught in the middle of a power struggle between Captain Franks and Nash. Nash is shown to be undergoing isolation issues very early on in the film. Things like emotional distress and paranoia. We'll get to more about paranoia in a minute, but like going through this struggle of extreme stress, more stress than anyone could really reasonably recognize, because isolation is a big struggle. I'm teaching health psychology right now, and we just finished a comparison of how stress, a discussion about how stress impacts your immune system. And part of that connection is loneliness, and how loneliness can actually straight up contribute to killing you because of how loneliness decimates your immune system. So you can imagine how these characters, again, before we learn that John is all alone, Nash is the first one to go through this. And so he doesn't appreciate the way that Captain Franks is keeping everyone sort of under strict orders to do X, Y, and Z each time they're out of stasis, and thinks that the mission is doomed to fail and that they are going to end up dying in space. And he wants to use the gravity well slingshot maneuver to get them back to Earth. So they're fast approaching the turn back window, right? The abort window to get them back to Earth. And so he wants to do that. But Captain Franks is trying to use all of the means that he has to prevent that, to make sure the mission goes forward no matter what, right?
You're sending us all to die!
Isolation plays a big role here because we've got depression, we've got anxiety, we've got the inability to focus and complete tasks when they need to be completed, right? On a timetable. People in space, in low Earth orbit or high Earth orbit, well, I guess low Earth orbit, and the folks that have gone to the moon and back, all have stated that, it's a sensory deprivation chamber. And not in the same sense of like putting blackout goggles on your eyes, putting headphones or earplugs in your ears, and then going and floating in a sensory deprivation chamber, right? A literal sensory deprivation chamber. But really, there isn't a lot beyond seeing and hearing that you get in space because it's such a sanitized environment, right? Then there's also the lack of social contact. And in this movie, it is very clear what the lack of social contact is. He's all by himself, at least at the end when we find that out. But even before that, right, there's only 3 other people on this large spacecraft, and they don't really interact with each other all that often. And part of the reason is because they're all parts of John's mind, right? The monotony of the environment also contributes, right? So day in and day out, well, what is a day even, right? So you have a clock on there to keep you sort of on a 24-hour circadian rhythm at least, but not really, right? And so, they go into, they wake up, they spend several hours completing tasks, and then they go back into stasis. So it's very hard to get a sense of what a day is, how long it's been, right? So the monotony will start to take a toll as well. I love when I was doing the research for what to talk about for this episode. I like space. I find it fascinating. I know a little bit about some space programs, especially history of the space race in the 1960s, all of that. But I didn't know a lot about some of the research that has been around, right? So one thing that I found regarding isolation and its psych impact is what is referred to as the third quarter phenomenon. Some of the research comes from polar researchers, so people who spend a lot of time in Antarctica, for example, at research facilities, which are extremely isolated, right? As well as astronauts, right? So there are 2 places where you can get this kind of isolation research conducted. Third quarter phenomenon refers to the experience of people having heightened emotional distress, irritability, and severely decreased cognitive functioning as they approach the later stages of a mission that has considerable isolation, right? So in this case, it's on their way to Saturn's moon Titan, right? Which takes a long, long time. But, in the real world, this could be on the way to the moon. This could be at an Antarctic research station, right? I'm thinking The Thing right now, which would also be a great entry into this program. I should find somebody who wants to talk The Thing with me. And so I thought this was really interesting because it's specifically about the latter stages of the mission, right? So not the buildup, not getting to the halfway point, but like the later stages. It's like, can we actually do this? This is getting to me. I'm getting stir crazy, all that stuff, right? This was highlighted in research by Bechtel and Burning in 1991. It's primarily based on anecdotes, which, to be taken with a grain of salt. But of course, like I said at the beginning, we don't have a lot of data, right? Only, I would say, several dozen, maybe in the hundreds, I'm not sure, people have been to space or been in this situation, right? Even fewer have been so far away from the Earth that we could even like explore that aspect, right? For example, Apollo 13, these three guys had to deal with an amazing problem. Their goal was to get to the moon, and unfortunately, they had to just orbit the moon and come back, right? And hopefully maintain their sanity and compunction on the way back. The movie, the Apollo 13 didn't really show this aspect of the third quarter phenomenon, but John definitely does, especially as he expresses those fears through the character of Nash, his hallucination of this worried aspect of his mind who wants to abort and go home. He wants to go home. His emotional distress is so high. He wants to go home and be with Zoe. But of course, he can't. And this leads me to that fight with Nash and Captain Franks. It's a good exploration of how isolation contributes to paranoia and distrust within a psychotic episode, right? So I want to separate a subclinical paranoia, right? Thinking that, something is up, thinking that you're, I guess maybe suspicious would be a better word than paranoia. Is there really subclinical paranoia? Maybe that's just suspicion or thinking something is suspicious. I'm just thinking like, you're paranoid that your friends are making a surprise party for you and you really don't like surprise parties. Maybe that, but because that would be negative. Paranoia, I suppose, would be negative in all facets. There's not really a positive spin on paranoia, right? But of course, you can have distrust issues. Those are fine. But we are going to subsume these ideas within John's psychotic episode.
What's going on, John?
He can perform the slingshot on his own as long as we stick together.
Nash, just take it easy.
What? You with him?
I see no evidence of any further
I
issues.
see further evidence that we're not
We're not fucked. There's no compelling reason to abort. There's no threat to our survival.
He told you to say
There's
that.
no threat to the mission.
He told you to say that.
I'm not gonna abort, Nash.
I won't participate in this. I won't.
Odyssey is broken. Everything around us is screaming, turn the around, and you're about to blast us even further into space.
John, is it possible for us to perform the slingshot without Nash?
Yes, we can. The math is in the computer.
You heard that, Nash. The math's in the computer.
So Nash is, quote unquote, the ship's engineer. His role is to keep things humming along, right? Franks is the captain, so he's the commanding officer. He is telling both John and Nash what to do when they are awake, and they need to do these things. Again, we don't really know how long it has been at the present time inside, and so for the viewer, that contributes to the uncertainty that we are feeling in John. So we end up with this situation where Nash wants to turn around. Captain Franks is like, no. Captain Franks' job is to make sure that the team stays refreshed, ready to do the mission, and not give up, right? Their goal is to make it to Titan. Franks' job is to get everyone on the same page and to complete that mission. So you end up with this like clash of titans, right? So Nash is growing in his paranoia, and Captain Franks wants John to be on his side and not fall into the paranoia of Nash. And it's really interesting. We get these didactic conversations where John is essentially talking to himself with Nash, and he's listening to Nash, and he's agreeing with Nash, and he's like, okay, I'll do the things that you're asking me to do. And then he'll have a conversation with Franks, and Franks will be watching them on the board or whatever, or the CCTV cameras all throughout the ship, and he'll have a conversation with John and be like, listen, man, you can't listen to Nash. Nash is going a little bit stir crazy. We got to finish this mission. And you'll see John agree with Franks in that, a little more timidly, of course. And the thing we get with John is that he is feeling like he's caught in the middle and he doesn't know. So his anxiety is high, right? And there is a lack of cohesion within the working of the command structure of the mission. But of course, as we find out later, it's just John fighting with himself. So a couple of psychological concepts that are apparent here beyond just paranoia are things like hypervigilance. So Nash is acting in a hypervigilant way, hyper aware of any threats that might be around. And in a lot of cases, some of these threats are imagined or exaggerated. Some of these cases, I maybe shouldn't say a lot. Sometimes these threats are imagined or exaggerated. But as we learn later in the film, this hypervigilance is actually John's own hypervigilance. And so he is aware that there's a threat, and it is being instantiated by his hallucination of Nash. And the rational part of his brain is trying to counteract this irrational part with Captain Franks. The other concept that I like talking about with respect to isolation and paranoia is social contagion. So things like anxiety and paranoia can spread in a group, which increases tension within that group and increased interpersonal conflict. This is, again, where like a good comparison with what happens in The Thing, where they all just start hating on each other because they think they've been infected by the alien, right? So, but in this case, it's a psychological infection. The contagion is purely from John's hallucination of Nash trying to infect John's, we'll call John the ego of this situation, where Nash is kind of like the id and Franks is kind of like the superego, right? So the id is trying to infect John's ego, but the superego is like, yo. Now, you might think, wow, Dr. Swan, you're talking about Freud in this way. Yeah, it's just a way to characterize these three characters. I'm sure they chose these three characters on purpose to be these particular aspects of psychology. It's not a stretch for non-psychological writers to draw psychological concepts from some of the more popular ideas. And of course, Freud's ideas about the id, ego, and superego are extremely popular. So I'm just, making a comparison there. Not to say that I agree with that situation, but the way that it's presented in the movie is absolutely id, ego, and superego, where the id has been infected by paranoia and distrust as a consequence of being isolated in space with no escape. Like in Antarctica, you can put a request in for a transfer and get the hell out of there, at least these days, right? And yeah, it might take some time. You might have to wait for a break in the weather to be able to do it, but at least you can get home. John's in space. He can't get home. So it's not surprising to me that his base level desires have become so corrupted by his isolation, right? And the fact that day in and day out, or month in and month out, it's the same thing over and over and over again. Of course, part of his mind is rebelling. That might be the id. Whereas ego is sort of caught in the middle with like, oh, we must complete this mission. We must complete this mission. When I was doing my research, again, I found more information that I didn't know about. So back in the day, in the 1970s, research was being conducted by NASA in these locations called Skylab. So Skylab 4 in 1973, it's referred to as a Skylab mutiny or Skylab strike. But there was a communications failure between the folks at Skylab with NASA control. And there was a conspiracy theory that, well, I guess it was a media theory, and that contributed to be it to be taken by others as a conspiracy theory. So the New Yorker published an article in 1976, 3 years after this thing, characterizing the Skylab mutiny or strike as a deliberate act, when in fact it wasn't a deliberate act, according to the folks at Skylab. The monotony just made them like from what I understand, the monotony from day in and day out sort of just like got to them, and they were just really, really tired doing the same things every day, and of course being isolated in this particular environment, and they just forgot to communicate with NASA control. And then when they did reconnect with NASA, recommunicated, everything then just went on as normal, and the Skylab 4 completed and everything like that. So the New Yorker published this article, claimed that the crew alleged to have stopped working on December 28th. Then the writer of this article, Henry Cooper, published similar claims in his book. Harvard Business School published a 1980 report, Strike in Space, claiming that the astronauts had gone on strike without citing any sources. NASA, the astronauts, and spaceflight historians said that there was no strike. They just said the astronauts were confused, right? Because and by the way, Skylab was up in Earth orbit, right? So Carr and Pogue, two astronauts, went on a long spacewalk. They didn't know if there was a ground equipment failure from that Christmas day, whether it was an issue in their lab or down on the ground, and it wasn't actually a mutiny. But of course, when you get this kind of high profile stories about space, something that most people have no conception, cannot fathom what goes on up there. Why Mark Kelly went up in space and his twin brother was kept down on Earth so they could compare. Like, these things are like really high level research questions, and it's entirely possible that the sensationalizing of this communications failure, low hanging fruit, in my opinion, of the situation, massive low hanging fruit, but it does speak to what could happen in real life. Of course, this is a science fiction film, and John is experiencing the effects of isolation, which leads to his paranoia and his trust issues because his mind is fracturing due to psychosis. Which leads us to perhaps one of my favorite psych concepts to discuss here with respect to psychosis is hallucination. Hallucinations, and specifically the reality testing at the end of the film. So hallucinations, just if you're not familiar, are created distortions in perception. They are typically vivid in their creation. Most of the time, as far as observations and scientific explorations in clinical science have observed, these are typically visual and auditory. And the visual and auditory hallucinations tend to be connected in the sense that auditory hallucinations support visual hallucinations and vice versa, right? So these are distortions in a person's perception. So much so in many cases of psychosis, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, that they appear real to the person, right? Like those hallucinations are real to that person. And in John's case, Nash appears real. He appears to be talking. He appears to be using the ship, interacting with the ship and its functions and its spaces and all of that stuff. Frank's appears to be real and holding a gun. And in one really, really traumatic scene for John is when he is told to go into stasis. And so he's going into his pod, and right before he goes to sleep, he sees Frank brutally attacking Nash in his own pod room, brutally attacking Nash, hitting him in the head with the butt of the gun, which is a 9mm pistol, hitting him on the head with the butt of the gun, and what appears to be a final shooting of him outside. And when you put it into context to the end of the film, when we learn that these two men weren't real, you're like, this is a battle that's going on inside John's head as he drifts off into a prolonged hibernation. And again, we don't know how long these hibernations are. Every time John wakes up from these hibernations, it's almost like his hallucinations reset. We get, a minute or two of John waking up from these, and it just being like a really long process to get his feet underneath him, to get quote unquote his sea legs underneath him, right? He's sitting next to his pod and he's just like resigned to it, or just like really tired.
Hello, John. You are emerging from deep hibernation. You are aboard the spacecraft Odyssey 1, bound for Titan. Please be careful. The drugs used to induce hibernation can produce mild side effects, including confusion, nausea, dizziness, and disorientation. You are 9 months, 1 day, and 18 hours into your mission.
We're awake. Good.
And it's only after he leaves this pod room that his hallucinations kick back up again. Other hallucinations that he begins to have, like I said, he dreams of flashbacks of his interactions with Zoe. At the end, he begins to have hallucinations of Zoe talking to him on the comms. It seems as though they lose contact with NASA control on Earth. Whether that's real or not, we don't know. But when he reestablishes communications, he begins to hear Zoe. Zoe says, "Oh my gosh, John, we finally reached you."
Hello, this is John aboard Odyssey 1. I need help. Houston, or whoever is out there, I don't know if you can hear this, but please send help.
John?
Zoe?
John, it's me.
Hi.
John.
It can't be you. This is not you.
It is me. Listen, are you okay?
No. I think crazy.
John,
I think that I killed Captain Franks. But I don't know, because I'm feeling a little bit confused. And I think that Captain Franks killed Nash. But I don't know if that's true either.
John, listen. I'm here with Sam Napier, and they asked me to talk to you. The hibernation drugs, the dosage was too strong. That's why you're confused.
Okay, I thought that might be it. Zoe, how many people are on the Odyssey?
Only you.
That is impossible.
Did you see any other crew quarters besides your own? Any other hibernation chambers? Odyssey can only support a crew of one.
How am I talking to you without delay?
John, I'm gonna put Sam on.
No, don't. No. You tell me.
Okay. You never left. You never launched.
What?
You were in hibernation before launch. ATS built a training facility in New Mexico. A perfect replica, reactor and everything. You're 1,000 feet underground. They needed to do a dry run without you knowing. John, I didn't know about it either. I would never have let this happen. You have to believe me.
I saw Jupiter. I saw Jupiter. And there was a slingshot.
It was all simulated.
It felt real.
It had to feel real. That's the whole point. The communication system was linked back to the surface. We're directly above you.
You come get me.
We're trying.
We don't know if those are real or not either. So this is the reality testing part, right? So he doesn't know what's real and what's not real. He doesn't know if Captain Franks is real. He doesn't know if Nash is real. And he starts to slowly learn. He wakes up one time in the third act, and he's like, to Captain Franks, he's like, "Where's Nash?" Nash is fine. He's just in his pod, right? But what that really means is that the part of John's consciousness kind of destroyed the Nash part of his consciousness, and Nash isn't coming back. There is an interesting parallel to dissociative identity disorder and derealization and depersonalization that come from dissociative disorders, as well, as a sub umbrella underneath psychotic disorders, where derealization is the alteration in perception of the external world, right? Causing people to perceive the external world as unreal, distant, distorted, or falsified, right? It's a dissociative symptom, but it's a subjective experience, right? So you have to characterize it within an individual, right? Within an individual. Depersonalization is also a dissociative experience, symptom, which is the subjective feeling of detachment from oneself. And so Nash is going in between derealization and depersonalization, and they're getting worse as time goes on. He is perceiving these aspects of himself as distant third-person qualities. Franks as this hard-ass captain who wants the mission to succeed as much as possible, whereas Nash just wants to go home, right? Franks wins the depersonalization battle, and John can only watch from the sidelines, right? That's depersonalization. There are a couple of real psychological aspects connected to space travel. So the first one, again, in my research, I learned about this. I didn't realize this was real, or I knew aspects of this, but I didn't know it had a name. Space Adaptation Syndrome, SAS, is kind of like space motion sickness. But instead of the body on a boat having a mismatch in what it's doing versus the environment around it, this is having issues with the world moving, but the body not, right? So in regular motion sickness, the vestibular sense is getting information from the body, where the head is in space, and the head is moving in space, right? In addition to things in space moving. So on a boat, a person is moving up and down, but so is the boat in relation to the horizon and things like that. And those two things might be mismatched, which causes motion sickness and nausea and things like that. Whereas, I mean, if you've ever seen the Vomit Comet, the jumbo jet that does the parabolic ups and downs to create periods of weightlessness, some people do experience nausea and that's the aspect of space adaptation syndrome, where the vestibular sense is not getting any information, but the environment around is moving, right? And things are moving in space. People are weightless, things are weightless, and there's not a lot of feedback. The other symptoms that are a part of space adaptation syndrome are reduced situational awareness, because it prevents a person from looking from getting information that from the environment that is regular, right? And so things aren't appearing as normal. Over time, lost muscle mass, which can contribute to difficulty moving. And this is a bigger problem in 0G to 1G environments, right? So space down to Earth. Of course, this probably isn't a big issue in the film because, again, they have artificial gravity, right? So there are some physiological things that happen in SAS as well that I thought were really interesting. Bone resorption, right, can form kidney stones because of lack of inadequate hydration, which could cause large amounts of pain, which might lead to incapacitation during spaceflight, which might not necessarily lead to that same incapacitation on Earth, right? Cardiovascular system has to work harder in 0G environments, even though the blood and arteries are doing muscular pumping. Veins are a system of valves. And then there's this thing called orthostatic intolerance, which is, an issue of, blood getting to the brain and providing the brain with enough resources like oxygen and glucose, which could lead to lack of consciousness because there's not enough pressure up in the brain, right? And of course, losing consciousness is a bad idea. A related syndrome that I found is called Charles Bonnet syndrome. People in visually deprived environments experience complex hallucinations, which totally attributable to John's experience, right? So people with significant vision loss can, so people who are sighted and then lose vision later in life will have these vivid recurrent visual hallucinations called fictive visual percepts. One characteristic is that they're Lilliputian hallucinations in which the character or objects are smaller than normal, right? So think Alice in Wonderland, the hallucinations that she was experiencing eating mushrooms. Oh man, hilarious. When you think about that film from a psychoactive perspective, that's one that needs to be on the podcast too. Sometimes these hallucinations are simple or complex. In John's case, let's call them complex, right? Shapes, grid-like patterns. Why not actual fully human beings, right? Those affected, though, with those who have Charles Bonnet syndrome do understand that the hallucinations generally are not real, and these hallucinations are really only visual. But let's say we take the grain of salt from Charles Bonnet syndrome and add the fiction part to it, and you end up with visual hallucinations from a visually blank and dull environment, a white, sterilized, gray, monotone environment where waking up from stasis has considerable sleep deprivation effects. And it's not real sleep. We can combine those two and be like, yeah, those are Charles Bonnet syndrome mixed with space adaptation syndrome, paranoia, isolation. Boom, you get that mix. You get the mix of fully capable hallucinations that must be discovered during reality testing to even know. And then even at the end, when he realizes that he is Captain John Nash Franks, or John Franks Nash, whatever the order of his name is, when he realizes that Nash isn't real, Franks isn't real, he's the only one on the spaceship, he still has trouble reconciling the remainder of that information when he starts hearing Zoe and he thinks he's on Earth. He opens up the airlock and he thinks he's walking out into a cavern to walk across a catwalk to an elevator to take him upstairs. And he launches himself out into space, killing himself. But luckily for John himself, it's the last thing he experiences. He gets that peace. Do
you know why moths fly into the light? When a moth is in danger, the best escape route tends to be towards the light. And what's the alternative? Downward towards darkness.
One additional thing that I wanted to mention were how John tries to cope with this confluence of psychosis and isolation. Coping in a crisis, particularly. So throughout the film, there are a few ways that characters are shown coping. One of the ways, very early on, when things are a little bit more hunky-dory than they are as time progresses through the plot. Humor, it's a good coping strategy. It's actually my favorite coping strategy for stress. In Frank's case, Captain Frank's case, he does one of two things. One, he relies on the humor, okay? He is probably the most joking person on the mission. And I think it's because he is resolute in mission completion. And so he doesn't dwell on anything else. And he brushes aside with the humor anything that could contribute to paranoia, second guesses, second thoughts, all of that stuff, right? And of course, Lawrence Fishburne is absolutely amazing when it comes to this calm, cool, and collected demeanor. And he uses rigid control to influence the other two crew members to make it seem like everything's all hunky-dory. Two other aspects of coping are apparent in the other two characters. I want to mention that Nash, as this like paranoid id, actually uses a form of coping called problem-focused coping, where the problem is identified, the stressor is identified, and solutions are evaluated and attempted. And so while the problem-focused coping is subsumed within the paranoia, Nash is at least trying to wrestle control of this stressful situation from the calm, cool, and collected Franks, which I think is important, right? On the other hand, John, as the real person hallucinating Franks and Nash, is experiencing maladaptive coping. And the primary way that he is coping unhealthily is by engaging in avoidance behavior. He doesn't want to engage. He doesn't really want to engage Nash. He doesn't really want to engage Frank in this struggle for power. He doesn't want to. He just wants to go about his days when he is not hibernating, and he just wants to experience the mission. But of course, as the ego aspect of himself, he is not able to do that because he's got these two other tugs, right? What I tell my students with coping is that for short-term stressors, sometimes avoidant coping is absolutely necessary. Sometimes you just got to do it. sometimes it is the only thing you can do. But for long-term stress, like, I don't know, being alone on a multi-year mission to Saturn's moon, you can't do that. It's going to lead to prolonging that stressor, okay, which is going to lead to cognitive exhaustion. And we see that. John experiences both emotional numbness and breakdowns. So really an inability to maintain any kind of emotional regulation. It's a sad ending when you characterize the real world aspect of John's situation, and you're like, well, this totally could happen to someone on Earth who is just dealing with extreme levels of loneliness, which is contributing or exacerbating underlying mental illness. It's really sad. And I think that the end represents a culmination of John not being able to shake what is real and what is not. And the mission to Titan was going to fail regardless. And he missed his window to return to Earth, to abort. So it's really tragic, a tragic character. I do agree with commenters and reviewers on this film that, it's a tight hour and 40 minutes or something like that, hour 45. There's not a lot happening here. Some character motivations are a little shaky, but of course, this is likely due to the narrative choice of making some of these characters not real and an aspect of the main character, and so do not have characterizations in and of themselves, just rather one-dimensional pieces of those characterizations for the mystery of it all. I think it's a pretty good psychological thriller. When I watched it, I immediately thought to myself, this is going to be on the show. This is my next solo episode. So that is what happened, and there's where we are. I do recommend it. I think it's a good one. If you are a fan of psych thrillers, it's a good one to have on there. Yeah, I did spoil it, of course. So go. I hope you watched it before you heard all of my spoilers. Of course, there is some ambiguity in the end. Maybe he wasn't launched out into space. Maybe he just had a brain aneurysm, and he died on a hospital bed after the isolation test failed, and he was not selected for the actual Titan mission. You can make anything you want out of this. We are approaching the 100th episode of this show. And if you've listened this far into the episode, I totally love you for it. Thank you so much for spending your time with me on this show, analyzing movies, listening to me pontificate about this, that, and the other thing. 100 episodes is wild to me. I'm probably going to continue beyond 100, but I just want to note that milestone, right? It's represented almost 6 years of my life, and it's been a great. So for the 100th episode, I think my plan is to get questions from the audience. What questions do you have from episodes previous, behind the scenes, my takes on films that haven't been on the program, suggestions for films to be on the show, all of that kind of stuff. Please send me a line on Facebook, on Blue Sky, and Threads. These are the 3 places you can catch me, or you can send an email directly to me through either the Cinema Psych Pod website or my main swanpsych.com contact information. I'd love to hear from you. Send me a voice note, send me a written note. I don't care. I would love to hear your questions. And on the 100th episode, I want to answer these questions. I want to go through these questions. So please send them my way. And that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.